Welcome to Conversations, a public access program brought to you each week by the Scarsdale Adult School. Here is your host for this week's conversation.
I am Joan Israel of the Scarsdale Adult School, and my guest today is Henry Graff. Henry Graff is a distinguished professor of history at Columbia University and a renowned expert on the study of the presidents. Professor Graff has written many books, including textbooks on American history for junior and senior high school students. His reviews and articles often appear in the New York Times. His best-known book is The Tuesday Cabinet, The Study of Peace and War Decisions under Lyndon Johnson. Henry, I would like to learn about the man behind this renowned national figure. What made you decide to become a teacher?
I think I never had any other aim in life than to be a teacher after growing up hoping to be a big league baseball player. But from my early life, I thought I wanted to be a teacher. And I'm fortunate, maybe unfortunate, in that I didn't have any alleys and byways before coming to the road.
It was your dream from the beginning.
Right.
And why history?
History, I guess, is as close as one can get to the study of the human being, and ultimately the culture we live in is the most fascinating medium, and I can approach it best through the study of the past and the consequences for the making of the present.
And you have a reputation as a president watcher. Would you comment on that?
I'm one of a growing group. I was once one of the first to teach a course on the presidency, in my case at Columbia University. Mm-hmm. I think we needed about 35 presidents before we could say we had an institution that could be studied with the individuals studied collectively. And just as we study the monarchy, we now study the presidency. Actually, conceiving of all the presidents occupying this place called the presidency is relatively new. In the 19th century, the word the presidency was very rarely used.
What
Lincoln
was used?
it.
How did they?
They talked of the office of the president or the president.
Uh-huh.
The presidency was the chiefship of the Mormon Church for most people in the 19th century.
Oh. And how do you see this campaign today? How would you analyze it today? For Bush?
It's one that is competing for public attention with the Olympics and with the playoffs and the World Series. I think that neither Mr. Bush nor Governor Dukakis have lighted up the world with brand new ideas, and it may very well be that they reflect a sense on the part of millions of Americans that we had better leave things as they are. I noticed that whenever Governor Dukakis has a proposal, it's pulled apart as if that kind of management isn't what people want. I think particularly of his proposal to make lifetime payments of tuition possible for many young people who can't otherwise get to college.
Uh-huh.
So we're not going to get into specifics, and we're nibbling around at the edges. The mudslinging and the nastiness, the sniping, is what we hear daily, and very little of it will have any relationship to the problems that America faces from January 20th.
I mean, they're beating around that, really.
They're not talking about the problems. They're not talking about what we're going to do about the deficit. We're not talking about increasing productivity. We're not talking about the kind of competitiveness in the world which grows more intense. Shortly, you're going to have a common market in Europe, 1992, which will make a vast new competitive entity. And no one is talking about how we will confront that fact. And that will come in the next president's administration.
Do you think Bush has his own voice, or at all? And do you think he will have a voice or his own as a...
Well, I don't know what sense you mean that, Joan.
I mean, will he follow in Reagan's footsteps, do you feel, or do you think that he's
I think each president has to confront the problems that arise. Whether he speaks with his own voice or not, I don't know. At the moment, he's speaking with the voice of his ghostwriters. But then again, so is Mr. Dukakis. The debates will give each an opportunity to show off what they can do without the help of their ghostwriters. But I think that Bush is imaginative enough, just as I think Dukakis is imaginative enough, to know when to modify what goes on and when to make changes. It would be frivolous to think that the new president is going to leave everything in place that Reagan leaves behind.
Do you see Quayle as negatives hurting Bush in any way?
It's very hard to say. The polls show that the public regards Benson, as Senator Benson of Texas, Dukakis' running mate, as much better qualified to be president of the United States than Quayle. On the other hand, the evidence is that most people in voting for the president aren't keenly conscious that at the same moment they're picking a vice president. Most Americans think only of the head of the ticket, and
it's
I don't think
I
don't think that Quayle is going to be an albatross for Bush.
You don't?
No.
He said something interesting about the fact that he about Truman in regards to his education. We were discussing the education of Quayle and that he wasn't doing well in school. Could you repeat that? I thought the audience would find that very interesting.
For people who criticize Quayle, and there is obviously much to criticize, just as there is much to criticize in everybody's record, and nobody matches up to that ideal person. I was saying as we were preparing for this program that when Truman was put on the ticket in 1944 by Franklin Roosevelt, most people did not know really who he was, although he had chaired a very important Senate committee. He was hardly a household word. He had never gone to college. His previous administrative experience had been as, he was called judge, but in Jackson County, Missouri, from which he came, that kind of judge was a road commissioner. He built roads. By the way, he built them very well. And he was also a product of the Pendergast machine, the machine in Missouri that ranked in venality with several other major political machines. So many people thought this was hardly a worthy successor to this towering figure, Franklin Roosevelt. And I recall being up on Capitol Hill the day after Roosevelt died, looking for a ticket to hear Truman address the joint session of Congress, which he was going to do after the funeral. And I asked the guard up on the Hill. In those days, those were usually veterans of the military service, and this guard had ribbons on his tunic, and he looked bright and clean and neat. And I said, any chance of getting in to hear President Truman? He said, what would you want to do that for? He said, after all,
like he was
who
an
is
entity.
Truman? He said, he's just a Coolidge with glasses, which is unfair to Truman. And I might also say probably very unfair to Coolidge, but I think this was a general view.
And he rose to the
And he rose to the occasion. As John Kennedy once said about being a good or bad or effective president, much depends on what you have going for you.
In terms of the country?
It means the country. And Truman had going for him the greatest victory of arms in the history of arms. He had going for him the largest navy and the unchallenged navy of the world, and exclusive possession of the bomb. In addition, he had all this pent-up demand for consumer goods, which was going to be an enormous stimulus for the economy. So we give Truman a lot of credit, and he deserves a lot of credit, but in Kennedy's words, he had a lot going for him.
The times. Do you think Dukakis's lack of knowledge of the foreign policy will affect the vote when people are looking to vote?
People usually find a reason to vote how they want to. I'm surprised that Dukakis has never been in Europe, but of course he's been elsewhere. He's been in Latin America, he's been in Korea, and
I didn't realize he hadn't been in Europe.
Never been in Europe, and I don't know how far back you'd have to go to find a president, and I'm now saying if he becomes president, who had never been in Europe before becoming president. I think you'd have to go back to the probably to the 19th century, late 19th century. I think from Buchanan, who was president on the eve of the Civil War, to Theodore Roosevelt, I don't think any president had been abroad. There probably are one or two exceptions, certainly not in Europe. But I think that when we talk about experience in the management of foreign affairs, we might look at Ronald Reagan. What was his experience in foreign affairs? What was Franklin Roosevelt's experience in foreign affairs, really, although he had been Assistant Secretary of the Navy in the First World War, and he knew something about Haiti. He always claimed he wrote the Constitution for Haiti. I don't think you could say Roosevelt was experienced, and I think that's a red herring, and it's unfair to Mr. Dukakis, and it's unfair to what we know about the presidency, that problems call forth solutions, and imaginative, able people sitting in the Oval Office become experts in the management of those problems. They're not always successful, but they get to know the problems pretty well. That's what we have a Department of State for. That's what we have a National Security Advisor for. That's what we have a Secretary of Defense for.
So you don't have to worry about the specific thing.
Yes.
If Dukakis did get the ticket, what do you think the administration would do about Jesse Jackson, his place?
I have no idea.
Uh-huh.
And I wouldn't comment on it because I would be guessing. And historians shouldn't guess. We'll see what he does, and then in a couple of years, we'll tell you what he did wrong or right.
What, for the public, what qualifications and qualities would you look for in a presidential candidate? With your experience.
It's like falling in love.
Is there chemistry in that?
It's a chemistry. It's an entirety. We want to know that he looks like a president, and the president can look in many different ways, can't he?
I think Dukakis is giving that feeling in the pictures
well,
that
maybe
he's...
to you. Other
right,
people see him
you're
as
right.
a man who doesn't have that.
That's true.
The man, I think, in American history who looked most like a president was probably the worst president in American history, and I'm talking about Warren Harding. So we have to be careful about looks. But certainly it's going to be someone who is telegenic, someone who will come across on the tube well. That, of course, would have rubbed out Lincoln, who
was such a great
was not the
human
handsomest man in the world, and who spoke with a shrill, high-pitched tone, which was not very attractive. People who heard him were always concerned that he couldn't, the decibels
project.
Weren't great enough to be heard in the back of the room. So, but we have to have a sense that the man is a man of accomplishment, that he has been around the mulberry bush a couple of times, that he's likely to be well accepted by his peers in the world, that he is personable, that he seems caring. I think that's a very important fact.
Caring of the people?
Caring of the people and of his associates. It's one point that is probably hurting Dukakis, that he is said to come through as cold, and he probably isn't. But I'm not going to generalize. When I think of the history of the presidency, Roosevelt had a way of looking down his nose at people. He wore those pince-nez glasses, and yet people cottoned to him.
He's had a fatherly quality, I think.
Well, whatever he had, I think people want the president to be both ordinary and extraordinary, and that is very tough.
I was going to say, that's pretty difficult.
Americans weren't very pleased with Carter when he carried his own luggage during his campaign.
Oh, when Johnson showed his scar, remember that?
Well, by that time, Johnson was already in the presidency, but I mean, it may be that seems to bring him close to the people. But it's a delicate touch, isn't it? Kennedy was the first president ever seen stripped to the waist as president, walking along a beach wearing a pair of swimming trunks. That would have been out a generation ago. I
remember reading an article a while back that you wrote about the presidency. They were learning too much about their personal lives, and it's more like a soap opera in some ways, and we have to get back to some kind of standard. I read that a long time ago. It's just coming to my mind now.
Well, I think that we are excessively interested in the minutiae, and we have made the president a kind of king, and so the president, therefore, is subject to being exposed the way court gossip exposes the king in the countries that have monarchies. And that, I think, is a very great problem for Americans. They want to know everything about the president. And one effect is to rob the president of mystery, and mystery is an essential ingredient of effective leadership from time immemorial. And television takes that away from the president. I must say, it takes it away from other leaders in the world. Of course, the Soviets have never gotten much into television for their political system. But in France and in England, leaders get to be so well known that you know only what they have done, but you see all the warts and you see them up close. And we do not know how to make effective leaders for long stretches of time in the age of television. They all ultimately seem very ordinary. And
We do that because we learn so much. Is that
we
what
learn
you
so
think?
much, maybe we learn the wrong things about our leaders.
We pick
We
on
learn
things that
about
are
what their
unnecessary.
families are doing and the difficulties that children are having, making a way in the world. And I think we tend to forget that we have selected an ordinary human being and we have said, now step forward of the ranks, sit in the Oval Office, and we will invest you with authority and power and make you the most powerful ruler in the world. And
Too
then,
much.
by Jove, we expect you to step back into the ranks when your term is over in 4 years or 8 years and be one of us again. It's impossible.
And I remember reading something else you said about that 2 minutes after you're no longer president, nobody knows you anymore. I mean, it's like
Well,
a shock.
Well, that was Truman made the
you-
statement that
I-
at one point he could talk talk a couple of minutes and he'd be read in every capital in the world. Now he could talk 2 hours. This is a few hours after leading the presidency, and no one would give a damn. That's, of course,
That's
the
a
nature
shocker.
of power.
How would you feel Reagan would be evaluated as a president in the future? How would you see that as a historian?
There are
kind of
several
president?
ways of looking at that. First of all, he's now only leaving office. So we'll have one judgment now. We'll say he was very popular. He will go out with the cheers of the crowds ringing in his ears. The first such ex-president since Eisenhower, and that's
He
a
has been
marvelous
popular.
thing. He's been very popular.
But
I have some thought that he probably could be reelected if he were constitutionally permitted to run. But I think also that we may want to look 5 years down the road, 10 years down the road. If what we're seeing in connection with Glasnost is the beginning of a long period of an alteration in the autocracy that is the Soviet Union, and this man, Reagan, had a hand in putting this great development on the rails with the great treaty that was signed on disarmament, for disarmament. Then Reagan is going to rank with some of the great peacemakers of history. On the other hand, if the Soviet Union turns around now and reverses course, or there is some great crisis in the world that pits us once again against the Soviet Union, that shows that the stripping of those missiles, intermediate nuclear missiles, was a bad move, then Reagan is going to get very bad marks. Presidential reputations tend to go up and down. If we should have a Great Depression drop on the head of the next president, and I'm not saying we will, but suppose we were to have some economic disaster, surely some of the blame is going to be laid at the door of the predecessor. We'll say he set the stage for this.
do you feel a lot is economics in terms of how they're evaluated too?
Oh, I have no doubt.
So a good
Ultimately,
deal is it?
we evaluate our presidents on
Yes,
the
how? That's
triumphs
a
they
good-
have won against the great powers, and how much they have made people feel comfortable in their pocketbooks. And the rest is all palaver.
In terms of a woman as a partner, what woman would you say in history was a great first lady for her husband? Or in
Well, I
office?
think there are many, and I think there have been very few successful presidents who haven't had a great woman at his side. I think.
Could you mention a few that you would?
Well, I think Eleanor Roosevelt, of course, she comes quickly to mind, but I think one has to put in Rosalind Carter. I think Nancy Reagan is
You do feel
exceedingly
Nancy
important.
Reagan has
I think
been.
she's been very important. I think that.
How? How do you feel?
Well, I think she has been a kind of gyroscope, a stabilizer in the administration. I think she has given him a completely trustworthy judgment on many of the people around him. And a president must often be saved from his principal advisors. I think she has done that brilliantly. But I think there have been first ladies of importance throughout our history. James K. Polk, nobody thinks much of Polk, who was president from 1845 to 1849, had a wife who was very active politically, Sarah Childress Polk. She was often called the Presidentress. And so it isn't something that began in the 20th century with photography and the television cameras. I think Martha Washington is a mighty figure in the shaping of the presidency.
How?
And she was
How
the
was
first.
she shaped
Well, she was
in those
at
days?
his
How?
side. They had no children.
Oh.
And she was his boon companion. And I have no doubt that she organized aspects of his administration that earlier historians were not likely to have picked up in that all-male time. And I put Martha Washington up at the top of the list, too.
Is there any woman who you would feel would be qualified to be, in today's world, a presidential candidate?
That's very hard to say. Because you were talking about Quayle. I'm sure there are women who exceed Quayle in whatever qualifications one might seek. At the moment, we have only 2 women senators, Senator Kassenbaum and Senator Mikulski. And there are 2 women governors, the governor of Vermont and the governor of Nebraska are women. But that may not be where we will draw the first woman president from. Perhaps she'll come out of business. Perhaps she'll come out of the university. Perhaps she'll come out of the home. I think we've been very narrow in our quest for presidents anyway. We've tended to look for pals. We've tended to look for lawyers. We, for example, have never elected a journalist.
You think that would be a good
I don't know. The
possibility?
French go in for journalists. Clemenceau, the great Georges Clemenceau, premier during the First World War, was a famous journalist. Once covered the city of Washington for a French newspaper. So we've limited ourselves. We've cut off half the people of the United States from eligibility until now. I think all of us who are in decent shape in the year 1988 can look forward to seeing a woman president or vice president within the next half generation.
10 years
Yes.
or so.
Yes,
Oh.
they'll be there.
Well, Henry, I want to thank you so much for being here with us for the Scarsdale Adult School and sharing your knowledge. It's certainly been a pleasure to have you and talk with you and someone of your knowledge and ability
Thank you for your
in this field.
hospitality. Thank you very much. Nice to be here.